This is part 2 of the Chapter 4 lecture notes. If you remember in part 1, we named the 4 tissue types. They are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So what we're looking at now is epithelial tissue, and we're going to look at different types of epithelial tissue. Okay, sorry. We're looking at different types of epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue that only has a single layer of cells is called simple. And there are 3 types. There's simple squamous epithelial tissue, and the cells in simple squamous epithelial tissue are very flat. So this is the thinnest and most delicate tissue type that there is, and it's going to be found lining the airways, lining the air sacs of the lungs called alveoli. Your lungs have millions of those, and those little tiny air sacs are very, very delicate. So they're composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue. We're going to learn about serous membranes later on, and I'll write that term for you. S-E-R-O-U-S. The serous membranes, which are listed here in figure A, are the pleural membrane, the pericardium, and the peritoneum. The pleural membrane surrounds the lungs, the pericardium surrounds the heart, and the peritoneum surrounds the abdominal cavity where your stomach and your intestines are. So those serous membranes that we're going to learn more about are composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue. Then you have here a kidney tubule, also known as a nephron. Your kidneys have millions of these tubules, and this one is cut in cross section so that you can see the cells that form the tube. And you can see it's a single layer of cells, so that's where simple comes from. But these cells are not flattened like the squamous cells. They're more cubic, cube-shaped or box-shaped. So this is called simple cuboidal, lining the kidney tubules. And then you've got simple columnar in figure C. Those are very tall. The nucleus, as you can see, is the nucleus of all these cells is kind of located in the same place, so it forms a row. When you look at several of the cells, there's a row of nuclei lined up. And the apical surface of simple columnar epithelium is often folded in these structures called microvilli, which increase the surface area. We find this simple columnar epithelium lining the intestines, and the microvilli increase the surface area for the absorption of nutrients. Okay, then we have the stratified epithelial tissue. Stratified squamous is layers of squamous cells, and this is what we find in forming the epidermis of the skin, or the outermost layer of the skin, is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. A big function of stratified squamous is protection. Then we have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. And that sounds complicated. It is kind of complicated. We find this tissue lining the airways. The picture that you see in figure B is lining the trachea. But pseudo means false and stratified means layers. So this tissue has the appearance of layers, but these cells are actually all touching the basement membrane. So it's really just a single layer of cells that looks or has the appearance of being layered. The top portion, the apical portion, is lined with cilia. because in the airways, that cilia is helping to sweep mucus up and out of the airways so that you don't get, lung infections like bronchitis and bronchiolitis. And then we have transitional epithelial tissue, which you find lining the urinary bladder. This tissue is designed to expand or stretch and then recoil. So when the bladder is empty, the cells look more cuboidal shaped. But when the bladder is full and the tissue is stretched, the cells, especially along the apical portion, look very flattened. They look to be squamous. So they change shape based on stretching, and that's transitional. Then we mentioned these before. The glands can either be exocrine or endocrine. We've already said that exocrine glands discharge their secretions onto a surface, and they discharge those secretions through a duct or a tube, whereas endocrine glands don't have ducts. They release their hormones directly into body fluids, blood or tissue fluids. Now, looking at exocrine glands, there's 3 types of secretion there, and this all depends on the damage that is done to the cell that is secreting the product. So in a merocrine secretion, and sometimes you'll see this as ecrine. I want you to be familiar with both terms. Sorry, that's a C. Eccrine. Okay, sorry it's so messy, but it's Eccrine. Ecrine and merocrine are the same thing. So a merocrine secretion it basically releases its product by exocytosis. A vesicle fuses with the plasma membrane and releases the product outside of the cell, and it does not harm the cell. An apocrine secretion releases the secretion along with a part of the cell. A portion of the apical surface of the cell is released along with the secretion. And in a holocrine secretion, the entire cell bursts. So the cell that does the secreting is destroyed along with the secretion. An example of where you would find merocrine secretions are the salivary glands. The product is mucin, which mixes with water to produce mucus. That secretion is a merocrine secretion. It's released by exocytosis from secretory vesicles. There's also a type of sweat, the watery sweat that you produce, not in your armpits or your groin area, but the watery sweat that you produce like on the surface of your hands, on your palms of your hands. This secretion doesn't have as much of a smell, but it's just watery. That's a merocrine secretion. But the sweat that does have a smell, and it's a thicker sweat, is an apocrine secretion. Another example of an apocrine secretion is the secretions from mammary glands. And then we have sebaceous glands or oil glands in our skin, and those are holocrine secretions. You can also look at the type of secretion based on how concentrated or diluted that it is. Serous secretions are watery and mucus secretions are thicker because they have mucus, and then there are mixed. And this table goes over the merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine secretions again, and it gives you a description and examples where you can find these different types of secretions. All right, number 7, identify the 3 cell shapes characteristic of epithelial cells. And that's going to be squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Number 8, using a light microscope, a tissue appears as a simple squamous epithelium. Can this be a sample of the skin surface? Why or why not? And the answer is no, because the skin is not simple squamous, it's stratified squamous. Number 9, name the 2 primary types of glandular epithelia, and that would be exocrine and endocrine. Number 10, the secretory cells of sebaceous glands fill with secretions and then rupture, releasing their contents, which mode of secretion occurs in sebaceous glands, and that is a holocrine secretion. And number 11, which type of gland releases its secretions directly into the extracellular fluid, which could be blood or tissue fluid, that is endocrine. Now we're moving on to connective tissue. And connective tissue is the most diverse tissue in the body. It contains 3 basic components. It does contain cells, like epithelial tissue contains cells that are tightly packed together. Connective tissue does have specialized cells, but those cells are surrounded by a matrix, and that matrix consists of protein fibers and ground substance. Another thing is that connective tissue is never exposed to the outside environment, whereas epithelial can be, like with the skin. And epithelial tissue is non-vascular or avascular, does not contain blood vessels, whereas connective tissues can be highly vascular, some more so than others. And connective tissues contain sensory receptors. Functions of connective tissue are support and protection. For example, bone is a connective tissue, and your rib cage and your skull protects the brain and the lungs and the heart. Transportation of materials. Another connective tissue is actually blood, and it transports nutrients and oxygen throughout the body. Storage of energy reserves. Energy can be stored in fat, in adipose tissue, and it can also be stored in bone marrow. Defense of the body, that would be the lymphatic tissues. And lymph is a connective tissue. This is a diagram that kind of helps you understand the classifications of the types of connective tissue. So connective tissue is divided into 3 groups: connective tissue proper, fluid connective tissue, and supporting connective tissue. Connective tissue proper can be loose or dense. Fluid is either blood or lymph, and supporting is cartilage or bone. In connective tissue proper, there are many different cell types, and we can see them here. We can see this cell is an antibody-producing cell, so that means it's a cell of the immune system. We see this cell is a fixed macrophage, which is also a cell of the immune system that phagocytizes germs. And then we have mast cells, another immune system cell that releases histamine. And we have fibroblasts, which produce all of these fibers that you see. The big thick fibers are collagen, they're for strength. The thin fibers that don't branch that much are elastin, they're for elasticity. And the reticular fibers have a lot of branching. So those are the 3 fiber types. And you can see some fat cells, which we call adipocytes. You can see another white blood cell down here, bottom right. That one's not labeled. I think that's good enough. So we find connective tissue proper under the skin and fatty tissue, and also tendons and ligaments are examples of dense connective tissue proper. Okay, the fibroblasts are cells of connective tissue proper that produce the protein fibers. So they're going to produce the reticular fibers, the elastic fibers, and the collagen fibers. Macrophages are phagocytic cells. They're large phagocytic cells, and they phagocytize either damaged cells or pathogens. Fat cells or adipocytes store fat. Mast cells are going to release histamine and heparin, which help to stimulate the immune system. The fibers are collagen, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers, and we went over those already. Collagen fibers are for strength